Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you. Today's program is part of the Presidential Primary Sources Project, and our program today is called President Grant and Civil Rights. It's being presented by the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. The Presidential Primary Sources Project is a collaboration between Internet 2, the National Archives, and the National Park Service. It's a series of programs we run every year from January to the beginning of May. This is just a quick reminder, by participating today, you are agreeing to be streamed, archived, and broadcast. So we do record all of these and we keep our recordings on our YouTube channel for teachers and students to access. We absolutely want you to participate today. It's a lot more fun if everybody participates. So I'm going to go over a few expectations for participation. If you're on video, you can kind of just raise your hand and we will call on you. If you're not on video and you'd like to be on video, please indicate so in the chat. If you are just participating via the chat, that's always there. So if you haven't found it, looks like a little caption bubble. We will use the chat a lot. So make sure you've located it. That said, please be very respectful of these interactive tools, especially in the chat box. Please keep any personal conversations out of the chat box. We really want to focus on using it just to ask and answer questions related to the presentation. If there is some kind of abuse of the chat, you're using it inappropriately, we do reserve the right to remove you from the program. All right, that said, we really thank you for being here. We're so excited to have all of you here, and this is our website. Check out some of our future programs as well. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Nick, who you came to see.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Nick Sacco. Sometimes I go by Ranger Nick, and I am a park ranger with the National Park Service. And so I'm really looking forward to giving today's program to talk about President Ulysses S. Grant and a little bit about some of the experiences he had as President of the United States. So to kick things off, I am going to go ahead and get my slideshow going here in just a moment. And if this works correctly, we should see a screen that says President Grant and Civil Rights. There's a picture of President Grant on the screen. So assuming that we've made it this far, I'm going to go ahead and continue with this presentation. Now, I work at a site called Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, and we are located in St. Louis, Missouri. Our reason for existence is because of the funny looking green house you see on the picture here on this slide. This house, although painted green, is called Whitehaven. This house has a very strong connection to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant lived at Whitehaven for about 5 years before the Civil War, and he worked on the property as a farmer. Whitehaven was also the childhood home of his wife, Julia Dent Grant. So Julia, her family, the Dents, owned Whitehaven before the Civil War. And Whitehaven was a plantation before the Civil War. It was a large property of 850 acres, and there were upwards of 30 African Americans that were enslaved by the Dent family in the years before the Civil War. Even Ulysses S. Grant enslaved a man named William Jones for part of the time that he lived at St. Louis as well. So working at this site is a good challenge because we talk about lots of relevant topics connected to 19th century American history, farming in America, causes of the Civil War, life in St. Louis, slavery, the Civil War itself, and Grant's presidency after the Civil War as well. Now, before we go too far, the National Park Service itself, we have more than 400 units throughout the United States. All 50 states have at least one unit of the National Park Service within their borders. So using the chat function, for those of you who might want to speak up in video, I would love to hear if anybody's been to a national park site before. Let me know. I'd like to see that right now.
Abbott says the Grand Canyon.
Okay, yep, that's a popular national park. Most of it's in Arizona. Good one,
We have Yellowstone.
Okay.
Other parks in the Midwest.
Very cool. Cool. Well, Yellowstone has a direct connection to Ulysses S. Grant because it was President Grant who signed the bill to establish Yellowstone. So not a central focus of our conversation today, but you have President Grant to thank for the creation of Yellowstone in
Oh, we have a few
18.
more here. The
Okay.
Badlands, the Apostle
Yes.
Islands.
So they're all really good. Yeah, Apostle Islands is a site I would love to visit someday. The Badlands in South Dakota, really neat site as well. These are excellent answers. So it sounds like you all are pretty familiar with the National Park Service and what all you can see and do at national parks. So that's really great. Awesome. Okay, moving along here. Now, Ulysses S. Grant was not originally from Missouri. He was born and raised in Ohio. And when he was 17 years old, his parents got him enrolled at West Point, sometimes called the U.S. Military Academy. So West Point is still around today. It's some of the best and brightest soldiers in the U.S. Army go to college at West Point. So Grant, when he finished at West Point, he became an officer in the U.S. Army, and the Army decided to send Grant to St. Louis. So Grant was sent to a fort called Jefferson Barracks, named after President Thomas Jefferson. And so Grant, when he's at Jefferson Barracks, he's never been to St. Louis before. He's trying to get to know people and get acclimated to life in St. Louis. And Grant got in contact with the Dent family at Whitehaven. So that greenhouse I showed you a few slides ago, this is Whitehaven in 1860. So this is the way the house would have appeared in Grant's time. So Grant was invited to come out to the Dent home at Whitehaven. And as he was meeting the various Dent family members, he met a young woman named Julia Dent. And so Ulysses and Julia, they fell in love with each other right here at Whitehaven. They were known to ride their horses around the farm. They spent a lot of time together on the front porch of the house. They had dinners together with the rest of Julia's family. And Ulysses even proposed marriage to Julia right on the front porch of the Whitehaven estate as well. So this is where Ulysses and Julia began their relationship. Grant went on to serve in the Army for about 11 years, but he decided he didn't want to be in the Army any longer because a lot of the time he was away from his family. So in the 1850s, Grant left the Army, and this is when he came back to Whitehaven to try his hand at farming. So from about 1854 to 59, most of the 1850s, Grant is raising fruit and vegetable crops, corn, wheat, potatoes, apples, and trying to support his family as a farmer on the Whitehaven estate. Things are going to change for Grant and really for the entire United States, however. For many, many years, there had been lots of debates about the institution of slavery in America. Is slavery a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does the Constitution protect slavery, or is it against the Constitution, or slavery against the Constitution? And so these bitter disagreements over slavery are going to lead eventually to 11 states in the South. And they decided that they were going to try to leave the country. They wanted to form a new country called the Confederate States of America. Oftentimes we just call it the Confederacy. And so this is going to happen in 1861. So this is a little bit after the Grants moved to Illinois, and they lived in Illinois for about a year. They were there when the Civil War broke out. Grant is outraged. He is not happy about this move at all. He fears that these 11 states leaving the Union, leaving the United States, could lead to the eventual end of the United States. And he believes that it's his duty as an American, his duty as somebody who had served in the U.S. Army, to fight for his country. So Grant offers his services and returns to the U.S. Army. And nobody really expects it at the beginning of the war, but Grant is going to get victories on the battlefield, and he's going to move up through the ranks. And by the end of the Civil War, Grant is the highest ranked military officer in the entire U.S. Army. So he held the rank of general, which is the highest rank you can have. And Grant was in charge of the entire U.S. Army, more than 1 million soldiers by the end of the Civil War. So General Grant is going to work closely with President Lincoln in prosecuting the war effort and trying to defeat the Confederacy. So this picture on the far left of the slide, that is a colorized image of what Grant's uniform would have looked like at the time. So soldiers back in the Civil War didn't have camouflage. That was not a thing back then. So the soldiers wore kind of a navy blue color. And this picture was taken a little bit after the war. And you can actually see on his shoulder strap there that Grant has stars. That notes that he's a general. After the Civil War, Grant was promoted to a 4-star general. He's our nation's first 4-star general. So this is a really neat picture of Grant. In our collection at Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, we have parts of Grant's uniform in our collections. One of the coolest things I think we have is this little hat badge. It's got the word US on it. And this is a hat badge that would have been on a hat that Grant wore sometimes during the American Civil War. This can be seen in the one picture where he's wearing the what's called a Hardy hat during the American Civil War. So General Grant gets national attention for leading the U.S. Army's war effort against the Confederacy. And eventually Grant is successful in this endeavor. The American Civil War lasted for 4 years. It remains to this day the deadliest war in American history. There were more than 750,000 soldiers who died. It was a horrific, terrible war. We call it the Civil War, but it was anything but civil. But General Grant eventually will defeat Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And this painting on the left depicts General Lee's surrender to General Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865. This signals the end of the Civil War. However, another crucial event is going to happen another week after the Appomattox Courthouse surrender. Does anybody know what happened to Abraham Lincoln a week after the Appomattox Courthouse surrender? Okay, so I see in the chat that several of you mentioned that he was killed, and that is correct. President Lincoln was tragically assassinated, and suddenly he lost his life. And so when President Lincoln died, Andrew Johnson was his vice president. So Andrew Johnson became the president immediately after President Lincoln's death. But for Americans, this was really scary because there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future is going to hold for the country. A lot of people had looked to President Lincoln for leadership, and they looked to President Lincoln to really take on an important role in preserving peace after the end of the American Civil War. But with his death, there's a lot of uncertainty about the future of the country. So what happens is that with President Lincoln's death and the end of the American Civil War, we're going to transition into a new time period called the Reconstruction Era. But before we get too far into the Reconstruction Era, I want to ask a really basic question. What do you think of when you hear the word Reconstruction? So when you hear that word Reconstruction, what comes to your mind? What do you think of?
We've got a lot of answers in here.
Okay.
It says after the Civil War, destruction, rebuilding, to rebuild what has been lost, to recover, remaking, constructing. So
good.
Really breaking down that word there. I love it.
Excellent. Great. Yeah, thank you. So a lot of great answers there. Rebuilding, restoration. So trying to kind of amid destruction or amid something that was very bad, very tragic, trying to rebuild from that. And that is a good summarization of what the Reconstruction Era was all about. Now, the American Civil War solved two different questions. On the one hand, with the Union, with the United States defeating the Confederacy, the Confederate States, they no longer existed. They came back into the Union. So the Union is restored and the United States remains together as a unified country. The other thing was that slavery came to an end. President Lincoln issues what's called the Emancipation Proclamation about halfway through the war. And this is an effort to try to end slavery in the Confederate States. And shortly after the end of the Civil War, we made a change to the United States Constitution. We added what's called an amendment. And in this case, it was the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which ended slavery in the United States. So the Civil War kept the country together and ended slavery, but there are a lot of other questions that remain unresolved. So even though the Union is restored, what would the country look like moving forward? Specifically, what rights would the freed people have? So 4 million enslaved African Americans are now free, but what are their rights going to be under the Constitution? Are they entitled to the same rights as white Americans, or will they have limited rights compared to white Americans? What does freedom really mean for these people who have been enslaved leading up to the Civil War. Likewise, should Confederates be punished? Should somebody be punished for serving the Confederacy, or should we let bygones be bygones and move on from it? So should Confederates face criminal prosecution? Should the leaders of the Confederacy be found as committing treason against the United States? Or once again, is everything cool and we're just going to try to move on? So these are some very difficult questions that the Reconstruction era is going to try to grapple with in the aftermath of the American Civil War. So one of the big things that's going to emerge during the Reconstruction era is the concept of civil rights. Now, we as Americans today, students from a very young age, are introduced to this term civil rights. It's something we talk about a lot. But in the years before the Civil War, there really was no such thing as civil rights. The term civil rights doesn't show up in our US Constitution before the Civil War. It is something that you would not see in any law book leading up to the Civil War. But during Reconstruction, political leaders at the time, particularly those in Congress, the ones who are making our laws, they're actively talking about this idea of civil rights. So let's go back to the chat there. What do you think of? What comes to your mind when you hear the term civil rights?
We've got the right to do something from our
Okay.
friends at Four Corners. Rights that everyone should be able to have.
Okay.
Human equality, the Civil War, rights and privileges people should have, human
Okay.
rights.
Those are excellent answers. And yes, I do like I like connecting it to the Civil War as well. So you had this Civil War, the concept of civil rights is kind of building upon, it's part of the Reconstruction effort of trying to make sense of what happened with the American Civil War. So it is important to view Reconstruction as an attempt to answer and try to give meaning to the Civil War. So civil rights are rights that are protected by the US government. They're rights that are given to all Americans, and they're rights that we enjoy that should be protected. So civil rights are very, very important. They cover some of the most fundamental rights that we can think of as Americans that we get to enjoy. So a few different examples of civil rights that emerged during the Reconstruction era. One of the most important things is the idea of citizenship. So during Reconstruction, there was another amendment, the 14th Amendment, that created this idea that if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. So all of us today, if you're born in the United States, you are an American citizen because you were born in this country. That comes about during the Reconstruction era. So citizenship is something, again, you have loyalty to the United States, and then you have rights that are protected by the government as citizens of the country. So citizenship and civil rights go hand in hand because citizens are entitled to civil rights. So examples of civil rights would include, for example, the right to enter into contracts. Prior to the Civil War, enslaved people, they're considered property. So enslaved people, they're stripped of their humanity. And the basic idea of slavery is that one human owns another human as property. Obviously, this is wrong. We believe that all humans should be born with their freedom today. And thank goodness we don't have slavery anymore. But the big change but the problem with slavery as well, one problem is that you did not get paid for any of the labors that you undertook. So the right to enter into a contract opens up the door for formerly enslaved people to earn wages for the work that they're engaged in. So it opens the idea that you can sign a contract and make money for the work that you do for somebody else, or for a company that you might work for, or for an individual that you might work for. Another civil right is the right to file a lawsuit and testify in court. If you have a grievance against somebody, if you have a disagreement with somebody, or if a crime is committed and you're a victim of that crime, you have the right to take your grievance to court, to have a fair trial, to have a judge and a jury hear your case and testifying. So being able to speak on your behalf, be able to speak your story and share evidence in a court case. These are basic rights that were not entitled to all people prior to the American Civil War. Enslaved African Americans could not file a lawsuit or testify in court before the Civil War, but now These are universally understood rights that you can use the court system to address any grievances you might have. Civil rights also pertain to the notion of equality before law. So in America, ideally, we pass laws that do not discriminate against a certain group of people based on their race or their gender or their religious beliefs or any other part of their background. The laws are written in a way to preserve everybody's rights, and they're applied to everybody equally. It should not be applied one way to a certain group of people and another way to another group of people. Now, of course, this is an ideal. This is not something that is always accomplished, but this is a remarkable platform, a remarkable principle that is being added to our laws and added to the spirit of American governance during Reconstruction, this idea of civil rights. There's something that is missing from the picture, though, and that is the question of voting rights. So who's going to have the right to vote in elections during this time? Once again, former Confederates who fought to destroy the United States, should they have the right to vote after the war? Enslaved people, many of whom never had a chance to receive a proper education, a formal education before the Civil War, should they be granted the right to vote during Reconstruction? These are debates that are taking place during this time. Now, Ulysses S. Grant, he is still a general for the first few years of Reconstruction. Again, Andrew Johnson is president from 1865 through 1868. So Johnson and Grant, first off, they don't really get along. They don't always see eye to eye on Reconstruction policy. And Grant himself is growing increasingly concerned because he notices that some Confederates have still resisted U.S. law. Some Confederates are committing acts of violence against African Americans. There's still a lot of uncertainty about the rights of the freed people in the former Confederate states. And Grant decides reluctantly, he didn't want to be president. He wanted to remain as general of the army, but he feels like if the American people want him to be president, he should put his name in the ring. Grant is really adored by many Americans for his role in defeating the Confederacy during the Civil War. So he decides reluctantly in 1868, he's going to run for president. And when running for president, Grant, with regards to civil rights, has a couple different things that he believes very strongly in. One is that he believes that African-American men should have the right to vote. He comes around, he sort of evolves in his thinking. He didn't always feel this way, but leading into the election of 1868, Grant recognizes that African-Americans in the South are anxious to enjoy the new rights of citizenship. They're the most loyal element in the South, that they're anxious to help rebuild the nation in the years after the Civil War. And Grant also recognizes that African-American men fought for the U.S. Army during the American Civil War. There was almost 200,000 Black soldiers who served in the U.S. military during the Civil War. So Grant feels that it's only right that if African-Americans are willing to put their lives on the line in defending the country, should have the right to vote. So Grant embraces the notion of another constitutional amendment, the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment is going to open a door for all men, regardless of color or regardless of background, to have a chance to vote in elections. So prior to the American Civil War, it was almost the exclusive right of white men to vote. But now the idea is emerging that Black men and other men of different ethnicities should have the ability to vote in elections as well. So Grant campaigns on the theme of "Let us have peace." That is his theme in 1868. Wanting to bring the country together to try to work through the differences engendered through the Civil War, to work through those sectional differences and to have a peaceful future moving forward.
We have a few questions there.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
You mentioned a lot about African-American men and white men voting, and we have a couple questions about women. So
sure.
They wanted to know if, what about the women?
Good questions. Absolutely. I can talk to that. So women were fighting for their own voting rights as well. As a matter of fact, some women actually broke the law and tried to vote in elections. There's a very famous woman, some of you may have heard of Susan B. Anthony before. So Susan B. Anthony in 1872, so this was the second time that Grant ran for president. He ran for re-election in 1872. Susan B. Anthony got arrested for trying to vote for Grant in that year's election. So women were trying to get the right to vote, but they could not get enough support from Congress. And of course, Congress is all men, right? And so women really struggle to fight for the right to vote. And sadly, most of these efforts are unsuccessful, and women are not going to get the right to vote until 1920. So almost 50 years after Grant is president, women will not get the right to vote until 1920. The one rare exception is that Wyoming, so the little state of Wyoming, it became a state in the 1860s, and Wyoming allowed women to vote. But that was the only state that allowed women to vote. The rest of the country, women could not vote. Great question. Is there any other questions that popped up?
Nope. Thank you so
Okay.
much for answering that. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, the process of adding an amendment to the Constitution is kind of difficult. So some of you may have learned about the process of creating a law. So Congress in Washington, D.C., that's the body that makes our laws. They legislate. And there are two different houses in Congress. There's the House of Representatives and the Senate. So you have to, in order for a bill to become a law, both houses have to have a majority, so at least 51% vote in support of that bill. And then when both houses approve, it goes to the president's desk, the president signs it, it becomes a law. The process of adding an amendment to the Constitution is much more difficult. And the reason for that is that this is a permanent change. This is laws can be overturned, but a constitutional amendment, this is something that's going to last and endure for indefinitely. So the amendment is first proposed in Congress. So somebody might have an idea in Congress to propose an amendment. And rather than a 51% majority, the amendment has to be approved by 2/3 in both the House and the Senate. So 66% of the members of both the House and Senate have to approve the amendment, which is very difficult to get 66% support on a lot of different bills. Then after Congress signs off on the amendment, 3/4 of the states, so 75% of the states, must then have their own vote to ratify the amendment. So only when 75% of the states ratify the amendment does it actually become added to the Constitution. So in more than 200 years of governance under our US Constitution, there's only been 27 amendments. And we have not had an amendment change since the 1990s. It's been 30 years since we've had an amendment to our Constitution. So that really demonstrates how difficult it is to get an amendment ratified and added to our Constitution. There's an entirely different process where a convention can be called to propose an amendment, but it's never been used in our history. So this cartoon right here, I love this drawing celebrating the 15th Amendment. So in the middle, we can see a group of men seated at a table here, and right in the middle is President Grant. Now, Grant, as you saw in the amendment process, the president has no direct role in the making of a constitutional amendment, but he spoke out in favor of the 15th Amendment. So he's seated in the middle there. But there's other men, even President Lincoln. So even though President Lincoln was dead by this point, he is included in this cartoon as well. But I would love in the chat function here, look at other parts of this cartoon. What else are you seeing that's going on with this cartoon here? What else sticks out to you?
We have war,
Okay.
slaves, war in the corners.
Mm-hmm.
The outsides have pictures.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Justice
So
for all.
sure.
People
Yeah.
on farms.
Yes. Good observation. So yeah, there's a lot going on here. So first of all, so there's men in military uniforms. So there's a man dressed up in an Army uniform and a Navy uniform. So this is supposed to speak to African Americans fighting for the U.S. Army during the Civil War. So making that connection between military service and civil rights. Okay. Then underneath that, we can see that there's so there are some military scenes, but then there's also a drawing of two African Americans, what kind of looks like a couple that are next to some cows. So that's supposed to refer to the independents. So African Americans having their own farms. They're not working for somebody else, but they're having their own farms and they're becoming successful in their own lives. And then there's also a drawing of a child, an African American child who's going to school. So during Reconstruction, there are schools built all throughout the country, especially in the South, for the formerly enslaved children to have a chance to get a formal education, to learn how to read and write and do mathematics. Then at the top of the corners, top left, the Justice for All, that is supposed to highlight the fact that African Americans now have access to the courts. They can file lawsuits, they can testify, they can have their grievances heard in American courts. And then the Freeman's Right, that refers to voting. So we can see African Americans in line getting ready to vote. So there's a lot of symbolism that's going into kind of connecting justice, independence, and the right to vote with the 15th Amendment here. Here's another cartoon that I really like. So we can see here, there's a line of African-American men that are getting ready to cast their ballot. And what I like about this here too, we can look at how the different men are dressed. So in front, there's a man, he kind of looks like a carpenter. He's got some tools in his pocket there. So he's taking off time from work to go cast his ballot. Then there's another man in a real fancy suit. So he kind of represents like a business owner or somebody who's become wealthy doing some sort of business or industry. Then behind him is a man in a US military outfit. So again, connecting Black military service with the right to vote as well. And you'll note here that on the left side, so there's an election official, and then there's these two glass jars. So voting back in the 1800s, you would have either a little token or more likely a newspaper article. So the ballots would be printed in local newspapers. So you'd cut out your ballot with your preferred candidate, and then you would put the newspaper clipping inside the jar of the person that you went to vote for. So voting is a little different today because voters today have privacy. If you were to go vote today, when you turn 18, there's a little booth that you go into and you're able to cast your vote without other people watching you. Now, during Reconstruction, voting was a public act, so anybody could watch you and see who you were casting your ballot for. And we'll get to why that was a tricky thing during Reconstruction in just a minute. There's another powerful symbol, powerful cartoon showing African-American voting during Reconstruction. In addition to having voting rights, African Americans also served in elected positions as well. So it's not just the right to vote, but it was the right to run for elected office as well. So this picture highlights some of the first representatives in Congress that were African American. So the man on the left, the far left, his name was Hiram Revels, and he was a minister, but he ended up being chosen to serve in the US Senate from the state of Mississippi. So he was our first African-American senator. There was also a number of congressmen who served in the House of Representatives during this time. So these men are playing a central role in the promotion of civil rights. So when the 15th Amendment is being debated and when other laws are expanding civil rights, these men are having a role in shaping those laws, and they're voting in support of those laws during this time as well. So there is a record number of African Americans serving in Congress during Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. However, not everybody agrees with these changes. Not everybody is ready to embrace citizenship and voting rights for African Americans, and not everybody is ready to see an expansion of civil rights. So I want you to take a moment to look at this drawing from Grant's presidency as well. Tell me what you think is going on in this political cartoon.
Birchwood mentions they see the KKK.
Mhm.
Someone has their face covered. An African American family.
Mhm.
Someone getting shot.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So these are correct observations. So somebody had mentioned the Ku Klux Klan, and that is correct. So in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan is organized in the South, and Ku Klux Klan is very strongly opposed to the expansion of civil rights and voting rights for African Americans. And so members of the Ku Klux Klan wanted to basically take matters into their own hands and would use violence if they felt it was necessary. So members of the Ku Klux Klan, they wanted to hide their identity. They did not want to be, they didn't want to get caught for the crimes they were about to commit. So very often members of the Ku Klux Klan would put bags or hoods over their heads to conceal their identity. And so this cartoon this is a very difficult cartoon to look at because it highlights the types of violence that Ku Klux Klan members would engage in. We can see an African-American family, most of which are around the fireplace. They're just going about their business. They're just trying to live their lives. And the members of the Ku Klux Klan are breaking in and ready to use violence and even potentially even murder African Americans. So going back to the earlier discussion, because voting was public during Reconstruction, members of the Ku Klux Klan would hang out at the polls and they would watch and see who was casting a vote and who was participating in elections. And then they would use that information to go to that person's house and then commit violence against them. So African Americans or sometimes it's intimidation, threatening not to vote again or to face consequences, or even sometimes outright murder of African Americans for trying to exercise their civil rights during Reconstruction. So President Grant is really worried about this. He continues to get reports during his time in office about the Ku Klux Klan committing violence against African Americans, and Grant is anxious to put a stop to this. Again, his campaign theme was "Let us have peace," and he is anxious to try to live up to that campaign theme. So Grant goes to Congress and he asks the lawmakers of the country to pass some legislation that would allow for him to utilize more resources to fight the Ku Klux Klan and other related white supremacist terrorist groups in the South. So Grant is going to work with Congress and they pass a series of 3 laws. And these 3 laws collectively, they're called the Enforcement Acts. There's a lot that goes into these laws, but these are some of the big things here. So one thing that's really important is that the Enforcement Acts gave President Grant the power to call out the U.S. military to areas where Ku Klux Klan violence was getting really bad. So if the federal government was getting reports that the Ku Klux Klan was committing violence in any particular part of the country or in the former Confederate States, Grant could call out the military to stop that violence. Grant does just that in South Carolina. So there were several counties in South Carolina where African Americans were routinely having violence committed against them. So Grant called out the U.S. military, and they effectively shut down the Ku Klux Klan through the Enforcement Acts. These laws also provide additional oversight of elections. So the U.S. government in Washington, D.C. is going to have more power to ensure that African Americans are able to vote and to be able to cast their ballot without threats of intimidation or without violence. So it's going to try to ensure that elections are safer for African Americans as well. And around this time, the government also establishes what's called the Department of Justice upon President Grant's request. The Department of Justice is around today and is one of the most important aspects of the federal government. The Department of Justice is tasked with enforcing civil rights. So we see the concept of civil rights emerge during Reconstruction, and the Department of Justice is the part of the government that's going to enforce civil rights. But the immediate context of the establishment of the Department of Justice is fighting the Ku Klux Klan in the former Confederate States. Finally, another important civil rights landmark of Grant's presidency was the passage of what's called the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So previous legislation had established the idea that African Americans could use the courts, they could enter into contracts, they had the right to vote. So these are legal and political rights that African Americans had. However, during Reconstruction, there was still rampant discrimination against African Americans because of their skin color. And there were still aspects of American life where Black Americans were excluded from full participation. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 tries to address what Americans at the time would have called social equality, and it mandates equal treatment in a number of different public spaces. So to give you an example, many cities throughout the country have public transportation. So today that might be a bus or a car or a metro or something like that. Of course, back in Grant State, none of those things were really around, but there were streetcars that were pulled by horses. So these streetcars historically discriminated against African Americans. They would either create separate white and black spaces, with whites having the more comfortable spaces on the streetcars and Black Americans excluded to the back of the streetcar. And in some cases, the streetcars did not even allow Black Americans to get on them and to use them for their benefit. So the Civil Rights Act of 1875 outlaws racial discrimination and racial segregation in public spaces like streetcars, movie theaters, restaurants, and all sorts of areas of public life where white and Black Americans would intermingle. It even outlawed racially segregated cemeteries. So it even required that whites and blacks would be allowed to be buried alongside each other in cemeteries as well. Equally important, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 called for equal access for jury service. So when you go to court, you have the right to have a trial with the jury of your peers. So a jury of your peers, meaning people in your community, would be able to hear the case and decide on your case. Most cases, there are 12 jury members who hear your case. So historically, only white men were entitled to serve on juries. Civil Rights Act of 1875 says that no African Americans are going to have the right to serve in juries as well. Because again, if you are going to court, you have a right to have your trial heard by a jury of your peers, not just your white peers, but your peers. Unfortunately, this Civil Rights Act of 1875, it was very forward-thinking for the time, and it was perhaps too forward-thinking because the United States Supreme Court said that this law was unconstitutional. They said that this law could not be, it did not line up with the Constitution, and so they ruled it unconstitutional. So unfortunately, this law was only on the books for about 8 years. But a lot of people, when they think about things like racial segregation and racial discrimination, they don't realize that there were fights against those things in the 19th century during the Reconstruction era as well. Okay, so again, unfortunately, despite President Grant and the federal government's best efforts to try to stop violence against African Americans, these efforts were not fully successful. There continued to be violence even after passage of the 15th Amendment and the Enforcement Acts and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. And this political cartoon kind of highlights the issues at play. So we can see there are two men, they're shaking hands. There's a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and then there was another group called the White League in the South as well. So they're teaming up together, they're shaking hands. And we can see at the top of the cartoon, it says, "This is a white man's government." So it kind of speaks to this idea that some Americans just simply could not live with the idea of African Americans being a part of government or voting or having civil rights. And we can also see an African American family, they're trying to shield themselves from the potential violence being wrought upon by the White League and the KKK. And to the right, we can even see that a schoolhouse has been burnt down. So one way that these groups like the Ku Klux Klan tried to attack African Americans is that they would destroy buildings that were central to the Black community, schools, churches, and other buildings that were important to the Black community. So Reconstruction is successful to a certain extent in expanding civil rights, but the work remained undone. As a matter of fact, the country kind of went backwards after the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s. Reconstruction was replaced by what historians call the Jim Crow era. And during the Jim Crow era, the late 1800s going into the 1900s, African Americans lost the right to vote through new laws like literacy laws that had said that you had to be able to read to vote, and poll taxes, where in some cases you had to actually pay money to vote. These things have since been overturned, but the 15th Amendment was essentially thrown out during the Jim Crow era. And a lot of the civil rights issues that emerged during Reconstruction are going to reemerge again during the 1950s and 1960s. So this is when we're going to see Rosa Parks fighting to end racial segregation in buses and public transportation. This is when we see civil rights leaders like John Lewis and Martin Luther King speaking out. So this picture here is from the 1963 March on Washington. This is the famous event in which Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, when he said that he wanted people to be treated by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. Take a look at this picture. So these people who are marching for the March on Washington, what do you see? What are these signs? What are they calling for? What do they want to have done in these signs? Let's use the chat. Let's see what you notice here.
Equality,
Okay.
freedom, equal rights, justice for all, homes, decent housing.
Yes. Good. So yeah, that's a good representation of some of the signs here. So even though this is happening 80 years after the Reconstruction era, we can see that African Americans are still fighting for basic civil rights. They're still fighting for the basic right to go to court, have their grievances heard, to have the right to vote, to have the right to participate in American life. Decent housing refers to the fact that there are many neighborhoods that did not allow Black Americans to live in those neighborhoods. There was deliberate racial segregation where white and Black neighborhoods were separate from each other because Black Americans were not allowed to move into those neighborhoods. There's a sign, kind of hard to see in the back, but there's signs for jobs and freedom. So there are certain jobs that African Americans are not allowed to work. Or if they do work those jobs, they're making less money than their white counterparts to do the same thing. So we can see that during the 50s and 60s, a lot of the same grievances that are taking place here that were emerged in the Reconstruction era as well. So it's important to make that connection between the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, and the fights that continued in the 1950s and 60s as well. So the work of promoting and protecting civil rights, in a way, it never really ends. We must always work to ensure that we're promoting equality and freedom in our world today. We always have to make sure that we're looking out for each other and promoting equal rights for all, regardless of our background. So to conclude, I love this cartoon. This is from Reconstruction. This is a good representation of, I think, the ideals of equality that are expressed during Reconstruction. It's called Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner. And the man who's cutting the turkey in the top right corner, that's actually a young, handsome Uncle Sam, but he's cutting the Thanksgiving dinner, and there's people of all different ethnicities at the table. So there's people from Asia, there's an African-American man, there's a Native American, there's people from Europe. So the idea here is that anybody from wherever they come from, whatever their background, they would all be able to sit at Uncle Sam's dinner table to enjoy peace and prosperity together in a good life here in the United States. So we can see some of the wording: self-government, universal suffrage. So suffrage is another word for voting. Come one, come all, free and equal. So this is really like the symbolism of this political cartoon and how it embodies how in some ways Reconstruction was a civil rights movement. And even in the back, we can see a portrait of Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, and Ulysses S. Grant as well on the back wall of this cartoon. So I'll leave you with this quote. President Grant, during his presidency, this is kind of a famous quote from his presidency. He said at one point, quote, "My oft expressed desire is that all citizens, white or Black, native or foreign born, may be left free in all parts of our common country to vote, speak, and act in obedience to law without intimidation or ostracism on account of his views, color, or nativity." That's a really long sentence, but it essentially states that Grant thought that all citizens, regardless of their background, should be allowed to vote and to participate in American life and enjoy the rights of Americans without discrimination based on their background. And I think that's an ideal that we can still embrace and fight for today. Thank you all so much. Let's go ahead, and I got about 10 minutes. Let's open it up for some questions.
While we wait for some questions, can you tell us a little bit about the National Historic Site and how people could come to visit, what they might see there?
Absolutely. So let me go back to my screen sharing here, actually. And so the greenhouse that I had featured on the one slide here, the Whitehaven estate is open for tours today. So myself and some of the other park rangers here, a big part of our job is giving tours to the American people of President Grant's home. And I shouldn't say just the American people, because I've given tours to people from all over the world who wanted to learn about President Grant's life. So we give tours of Grant's home. We have a movie about Grant's life. It's about 22 minutes long, and we have a museum. In that museum, you can spend 2 minutes or 2 days checking out everything in our museum. So tour, film, museum. A lot of people take about maybe 90 minutes, maybe half a day to see everything at our park here. So, and for reference, some of you are probably familiar with the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. The Gateway Arch is also part of the National Park Service. That's about 12 miles from Whitehaven. So we're in the St. Louis area, not too far away from the Gateway Arch. So if you come to St. Louis, you come and visit both sites that are part of the Park Service. And we're free. That's important too.
All right, we got a few questions here. Abbott wants to know, how long was Grant president?
Good question. So Grant was president for 8 years. He was first elected in 1868 and reelected in 1872. So one of the amendments, the changes that we made to our Constitution, is that we said that presidents can only serve for 2 terms. They can only serve for 8 years maximum. So Grant served the maximum 8 years in the White House.
Birchwood asked, were there any amendments that were proposed during Grant's presidency that were not ratified?
Great question, and the answer is yes. Going back to the fight for women's rights, there was a proposed 16th Amendment that would allow for women to have the right to vote, and it never made it through Congress. So there was a failed effort, again, to try to get women the right to vote as well, and it was unsuccessful.
We have a couple more questions. One about why there was so much violence against Black people.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I could probably take all day giving you the answer to that. And unfortunately, what a lot of it comes down to is just simply racial discrimination and racial prejudice. And we see the history of slavery here in the United States. Now, of course, you hear slavery existed in many different societies, and the United States is not unique in the sense that slavery had existed for part of our history, but American slavery was based on race. It was based on the idea that the proper place for African Americans was in slavery. So in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, slavery had existed for 200 years, more than 200 years, when the Civil War came to an end. So the reality is that it took time for people to try to adjust to this new idea that African Americans are entitled to the same rights as white Americans. And sadly, a lot of the resentment and the racism plays out in violence. So the Reconstruction Era is noteworthy for the dramatic changes, positive changes it brings to American society, but alongside those positive changes comes a lot of violence as well, sadly.
Do you know what percentage of the population were African Americans at that time?
That's a good question. So I will say that in the American South, in the former Confederate states, it kind of varied. So in some states, the Black population could have been around maybe 25% or 30%. But in the states of Mississippi and South Carolina, a majority of residents were Black. That was the case before, during, and in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Now, in the North, it's a much different story. Most northern states, the Black population is only about 1 to 5% of the population. So African Americans, however, at the end of Reconstruction and in the early 1900s, started moving to the North. So those numbers are different today, and there's a lot of Black Americans that live in the North today. But that was during the Jim Crow era. That is not during the Civil War era. And in fact, a lot of Black Americans left the South after Reconstruction because they knew that their rights were in danger if they remained in the South.
Gotcha. Well, I don't think we see any more questions. So if there are no other questions, I just want to thank everybody for attending. We really appreciate you being here and you participating. And Nick, thank you so much. We really This was a great presentation. We really appreciate your time and all your knowledge.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure. I had a lot of fun doing it. I really appreciate everybody's active engagement. I was blown away by all the chat comments, so that's really great. And I'll just throw out too that again, in addition to coming to St. Louis, if you wanted to visit the park, we really encourage you to do that. But how about in the chat function here? I'll put a link to our website as well, because we have a lot of resources on our website, and we have a lot of articles on our website too. So now we have stuff not just about Grant's presidency, but also his generalship during the Civil War, his life here at Whitehaven as a farmer. So it's a lot more resources to jump into with General Grant's really interesting life. So I just encourage you to check out our website. And if you're old enough to be on social media, check that out too.